Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature.
It was an election tradition for the past 30 years, but now the Washington Post says the paper will be, quote, returning to their roots of not making presidential endorsements. The Post publisher, William Lewis, says this decision is, quote, consistent with the values the Post has always stood for. However, according to reports, the paper was ready to endorse Vice President Harris, but billionaire owner Jeff Bezos nixed it. It comes as the LA Times is facing fallout for its own decision to not endorse either candidate.
For decades, newspaper endorsements have been a fixture of American elections. Research suggests they can even sway a candidate's vote share by 1 to 2%, a small margin, but in a tight race enough to matter. And yet in 2024, some of the most influential editorial boards, including the Washington Post and the LA Times, opted out entirely. This shift raises big questions. Why are newspapers backing away from endorsements? Is it a sign of increasing media hesitancy to weigh in on political matters? And what does it tell us about the broader role of the Fourth Estate in a time of growing threats to democracy? And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckemeyer, and today I'm joined by Michael Deas. As a former editor at the Chicago Tribune, Michael has spent years on the front lines of journalism. Today, he teaches editing and multimedia reporting at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, shaping the next generation of journalists. In our conversation, we discuss the pressures on modern journalism, from defamation lawsuits and media consolidation to the rise of alternative platforms and the erosion of trust in traditional news sources. It's an important and timely topic, so let's get right to it. Michael Deas, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Thank you for the invitation, David.
So I have sort of broadly kind of 4 or 5 areas I want to cover. And the first one I know is kind of really in your wheelhouse, and I know it's something you're concerned about. You've already done some writing about this, kind of this media's role and some of these hesitations that we're seeing, right? So, why is the media hesitant to provide context on how Trump's autocratic actions threaten checks and balances, executive power in the Constitution? Or maybe I'm just wrong on that presumption, and they are doing that.
Well, David, I wonder whether much of the public realize that 6 companies are controlling the media landscape. You have GE, you have Disney, you have News Corp, you leave Viacom, but there are 6 companies controlling 90% of the media that we consume. And if you add the hedge funds, which are buying a number of newspapers, such as Alvin and Cannell, that's also driving the coverage as well, in my opinion. Those who are familiar with hedge funds typically buy newspapers. I think Alvin has purchased 15, including the paper for which I used to work, the Chicago Tribune. Hedge funds typically decimate the staffs of newsrooms and sell off the profits. Another thing that's dangerous about hedge funds is that it can lead to closures of local operations. It can lead to political polarization, which can also result in voter apathy. It can also lead to corruption, local corruption, because we don't have enough journalists to aggressively cover these stories. And it can lead to the financialization of the news market as well by these ultra wealthy individuals. So we have to look at, from a standpoint, who's controlling the media landscape.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's not a new problem. I mean, people were writing about this probably 25 or 30 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it seems like it's only gotten worse to some degree too. That creates a challenge. So we didn't see. Well, I think you cited the idea that 3/4 of news outlets chose not to endorse a presidential candidate in 2024, which is new. A lot of that's pretty new that it was that big of a number. Now, I mean, I'll say that I think the impact of those presidential endorsements has really gone down over time as people spend more. Well, they lose faith in those institutions. Plus, they look at other alternative sources more, and a lot of people are just locked in. Like, it doesn't make any difference what the newspaper says. But why do you think that happened? That we had so few endorsements?
Well, I think, again, this is my opinion. I think a number of these organizations probably realized that Trump was highly likely to return to the White House. For example, Jeff Bezos, who was Trump's nemesis, or they were in a feud during his first administration, first term, flipped. His opinion editor at large stepped down and accused Bezos of appeasing Trump. Um, Obviously, Bezos is one of the richest people in the country. He has a lot of business interests, and apparently, a number of other news organizations followed suit. And I believe it was to appease the president. Now, there are some organizations, such as the Los Angeles Times and I believe the New York Times, that actually endorsed a candidate, but largely 70%, 75% decided not to endorse anyone. In previous years, I think in 2016, there was a much fewer number of operations that elected not to endorse, but clearly within the past 8 years, that number has risen substantially. So I think, again, we have to look at it from the standpoint who's basically calling the shots for these organizations. And also, the Washington Post was prepped to endorse Harris until Bezos instructed or told the paper to back off. So, yeah, I think we have to look at the business interests.
Well, it's probably the same reasoning that we see this recent sort of oddly worded memo about from Bezos about the opinion section. You know, more sort of another indicator of this kind of pressure on journalists. You know, and I think it's almost intentionally oddly worded, so a lot of the public don't really know what it means. It also is, maybe it's one of those things that it can mean whatever you want it to mean too. You know, it's not very clear. So you know, facing these kind of challenges, you know, how do you think they can effectively push back against these attacks?
Yeah, that's a $64,000 question. Clearly, if you're looking at mainstream media or television media, you're looking at media people who are being paid millions of dollars. It's very unlikely, in my opinion, that they're going to push back. In fact, before Trump's inauguration, you might remember that the CNN boss has told his media stars or hosts not to criticize Trump during the inauguration, you know, bringing up past misdeeds and convictions. That's an example of how the corporation is controlling the content, or basically instructing or directing their media people to basically maybe soft pedal on the news or back off. And that's I think, one of the many implications that I think these lawsuits have had on media companies. For example, my concern is that it can impact the journalistic integrity. It can have a chilling effect on investigative reporting. It can lead to self-censorship, which you just brought up earlier. You know, reporters might shy away from reporting controversial stories, even if they do have the facts. Fear of litigation. Defamation lawsuits are costly. Even if an organization wins, it still puts a strain on their finances. And let's not forget smaller operations. Now, because a number of operations do not have deep pockets like ABC, CNN, NBC, which just recently settled a lawsuit with a Georgia gynecologist. These organizations have deep pockets. Smaller operations like newspapers or even online news outlets do not have that amount of money to pay towards settlements or to settle a lawsuit. Something else to keep in mind, it can also have an impact on public discourse, and that's what we're kind of discussing. as far as the impact on public discourse. If journalists are reluctant or hesitant to tell the truth, or if their companies basically direct them not to tell the truth or to report aggressively, it does affect public discourse or rational discourse, and that leads to a results in a uninformed electorate.
Well, and that's where I was going to head next. I wonder, have we crossed a red line already, or what? How would you define that red line? Of are we already there?
We've been there. We have been there for a number of years. That has been one of my concerns for a number of years. Not only the public, but I'm also concerned about journalists. Now, some might take for granted that journalists are well versed with the branches of government, civics, but that's not necessarily the case. So, in some instances, we're having uninformed journalists trying to inform the public, and that doesn't make any sense. So I think much of it has to do with civics education across the board. And I don't want to go off on a tangent, but there are roughly 17 states that offer civics programs in schools. I don't think that's by accident, but I think we're experiencing the repercussions from the lack of civics education and news literacy in schools.
Well, and that does highlight something that we kind of chatted about a little bit before we got started, about this idea of these threats to our republic, to the constitutional system we operate in, can be really abstract to people, because often they don't really understand, like Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. And when people are throwing around, oh, that's a violation of Article 2, or that doesn't align with Article 1 or whatever, a lot of people have no idea what that means or why that matters. Like, why does it matter that the president doesn't live in this space and doesn't do these things? And I think for a lot of people, it's very abstract, and they don't really care. It's like, why should that be the law? Like, well, it is the law, though, and that's kind of the world that we created. So I think that speaks to I see a lot of these arguments online, and people that kind of are in favor of one thing or another, or then these arguments that people put out about sort of quoting or just make loose references to the Constitution. And for a lot of people, they have no idea what that means. Like, I don't know what it means to say it's a violation of Article 2, right? And you're right. I mean, it is frustrating sometimes, and I think you've seen these citations too, or these ideas too, where I think it's something like 52% of people or something couldn't pass the citizenship test.
Oh, yeah, I'm not surprised, David. In fact, when a civics exam was administered it was a civics exam that was administered in 50 states. Only one state passed, the residents in one state passed the civics exam. And I think it was the state of Vermont. And you also, speaking with respect to civic ignorance, at the outset of the Russian-Ukraine war, a number of, I forgot how many, but a number of people were polled as far as they were asked to identify the second largest country in Europe. Now, mind you, Russia and Ukraine had just, the conflict had just begun. Now, I think only a small percentage of people were able to identify Ukraine as the second largest country in Europe.
It's huge, by the way.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to refer back to the map again and realize how big it really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this takes me to some of this second and third order type effects that I'm concerned about a lot, which are things like, as we move into an environment where you sort of don't have what I guess we can call traditional media kind of taking this fourth estate role of really reporting on things and being critical, and letting the public know where they're reluctant to report on anything like that. Where does that leave kind of the alternative media and again, this kind of feeds back into the journalist questions too. Where do journalists go and what do they do? But if the major news organizations start pulling back on these critical stories, whether it's legal risks or for other reasons, and so what does that mean for the information landscape? Like what's the substitute for citing major outlets. Like, for a show like mine, people are going to ask me, well, where was this reported? Can you give me a citation? The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or whatever. If those sources really aren't reporting on this stuff, what's something that can help validate my research and my work that would still give it credibility?
You know, again, that's a rather tough question. Typically, what I would advise news consumers to consume, well, to evaluate news is to listen to or to consume news from various outlets. Just don't rely on the news, domestic news, because every country engages in propaganda. For example, I'll watch news, domestic news, but I'll also consume news from, say, for example, the BBC, Al Jazeera, or anywhere else in the world. Because I also realize that we are subject to propaganda as well. And then after consuming that information, then we can make a reasoned inferences based on the news that we consume. It's rather challenging given that there are so many, the media landscape is so fragmented and there's so much distrust in the media, understandably, that it's a difficult landscape to navigate, but that's one approach. Basically, consume news from a variety of sources and then credible sources. And how do you define credible sources given that people are locked into their silos? Um, that's a hard one, David.
Yeah, I mean, when there are original sources, obviously, maybe you can refer to an actual bill or you can refer to a court case or something like that. That's
Right.
but that's not always, one of the options because you're kind of relying on somebody else's good investigative journalism.
Exactly.
Well, and I think one thing that bothers me is that historically, this is what autocratic regimes do, right? They kind of try to erode trust. So that there is no truth, basically. I mean, that's literally like, I think it was like a KGB phrase, there is no truth kind of thing.
Right.
Or everybody lies, is kind of a, KGB thing. The truth is impossible to find. Like that's kind of what and the objective of that tends to be to just create this disengagement. Like, and I hear people say this all the time, like you can't trust anybody, they're all lying to you or whatever. And I that really concerns me because that is the autocratic playbook, right? I feel like we have to establish something else, even if it's not our traditional media sources. We have to establish somewhere where we start saying this cadre of former journalists of the Wall Street Journal or whatever are highly trusted, something like that. I just don't know what that looks like, but it feels like we need something like that.
Yeah, we do. Again, the challenge is that I believe that Trump has skillfully convinced a number of people, or he has fed into the distrust of a number of people with respect to journalists. He for years he has declared journalists as the enemy of the people. And again, these lawsuits uh, feed into that. It feeds into that narrative.
And that spills over into, folks that are not necessarily far right or MAGA people. It spills over into everybody across the spectrum. I hear this from people all across the spectrum that, these news sources just aren't reliable. I don't trust any of them, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And people are checking out. And I think a large part of it also is that the public, much of the public has a difficult time differentiating between journalists and media personalities. In the piece that I recently wrote, that journalists and these media personalities are basically stars. They are under quite a bit of pressure. Journalists are under pressure to break news first, as we saw with the CNN story on Afghanistan, in which the journalist basically accused the contractor of taking advantage of desperate Afghans fleeing the country in the wake of the U.S. announcing that it's going to pull out. In fact, I think even in that story, I think the term black market was used incorrectly. Then we take a look at the Let's refer to the George Stephanopoulos, who essentially on air defamed the president by saying that he was found liable for rape as opposed to sexual abuse, even though that's a subtle but it's a significant distinction. And then just the recent, I think I brought this up earlier, NBC accusing this Georgia gynecologist of being a uterus collector. All right, that's a buzzword. But I think the problem exists because these individuals are under a lot of pressure to break the news first, and these media personalities are under pressure to attract audiences but keep audiences. So sometimes I think that opens the door to making false statements.
Yeah, and I think at some level they almost see it as a price of doing business, right? They well, we're going to get so many lawsuits, but we need these really outrageous stories, like you say, to keep the audience.
Yeah, yeah.
I know it's something that all the we hear a lot about with Connors Institute, of these kind of challenges, right? About media and media reliability. And so what can you offer us in terms of, and I think I would say offer both journalists, like what's a good strategy for journalists to sort of navigate these waters individually, and then what's a strategy for us as consumers? You already mentioned the idea of multiple sources, and I do like the idea of foreign sources. I think that's really important to factor into it. But and I talk about the idea of the psychology of this a lot on my show, and I talk to a lot of experts about that. And then I see these patterns when I interact with folks that we are, and again, this is talked about a lot in The Poisoning of the American Mind and others at Connors Institute. But this idea that we're very polarized in how we look at the news, right? When it's a story that kind of supports our view, we don't ask for many facts or much research about it. And what if it's not a story that supports our view? Now we just keep going deeper and deeper and try to find, shoot holes in that story. And that's not going to probably go away anytime soon. But, and I think that's a challenge for journalists as well, right? Because you can't ever satisfy that audience that just is going to keep shooting holes in it one way or another because they just don't want it to be true.
No, I concur. David, I'm just going to digress just a little bit, somewhat.
Please.
So, there's another reason that I believe that there's so much distrust in the media. A number of individuals in the media, and I'm referencing television. Again, these are reporters who are earning or making millions of dollars. I think Lester Holt I think his salary is $10 million. The relatability, a number of these journalists are trying to project the image that they understand the public, but there's a separation. These individuals have more in common with the politicians. They run in those circles. They do not run in our circles. And I think that's another disconnect. And that's another reason that perhaps the public has this distrust of journalists, because they probably see these journalists and politicians basically operating within the same space, But getting back to your point, I think civics education is quite important. Also, I believe that all journalists, reporters, as well as editors, need to rededicate themselves to cross-examining content. Even as a reporter, reporters should not only rely on editors, but reporters need to cross-examine everything that they report, every word, every source, not to leave any stone unturned. What has happened in the industry, and this started a number of years ago, newsrooms began to devalue fact checking and editing, even though we're kind of seeing minutes now, but I mean really hardcore fact checking. And this has foreshadowed the decimation of the editors and newsrooms, the devaluation of editing in the media, foreshadowed a number of problems that we're seeing in the media right now. In fact, I predicted years ago that at some point we were going to see a number of defamation lawsuits. and it has become a reality. So this is of no surprise to me. In fact, when I learned about the ABC lawsuit, I had just had a conversation with someone a day earlier, expressing that, I'm expecting to see more lawsuits. And lo and behold, we're seeing lawsuits. And one of my concerns is that these lawsuits can be weaponized to silence criticism. I think Trump is doing this right now. There's a term for this. I think it's called uh, strategic lawsuits against public participation. And I think we're going to see more of this. Another problem with this is that it's particularly problematic for investigative journalism. So I think so much of this is of no surprise to me. I pretty much predicted this years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we often look at the past through rose-colored glasses, we kind of look at these golden years of Walter Cronkite and this kind of thing as, well, it was the perfect media landscape, but it wasn't either. It had its own challenges then as well. So we kind of want that. Like, we want a nice half an hour summary that tells us everything we need to know, but it's probably not realistic, and we're not going to ever go there.
No, we're not. And I agree with you there. In fact, I've often said that even though I yearn for the legacy media of the past, but it wasn't perfect. Number one, it wasn't diverse. All right.
Right.
And so that in itself is a flaw. But I do believe, as you realize, many of us were consuming our news from the same trough, 3 networks. There wasn't this fragmentation. So I think that kind of helped us make progress. But now that everyone is, finding themselves in different silos, it's like the Wild West.
Yeah, and we live so much in those silos that it's almost like a shock on our system when we get exposed to media that's not speaking in that same lockstep with that media. So yeah, it's a tough problem. It's a tough problem. I like I say, I think the big piece is we have to take some responsibility to expect to be shocked a little bit. Like, go out and find other sources and expect to be kind of mad. Like, oh wow, that is like, I don't like that. That's like, and when you don't like it, it's almost like that's when you should probably lean in and maybe push, as you say, be critical, be a critical news consumer of that stuff you were in love with before. Lean into that feeling uncomfortable piece and just get more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
You're absolutely right, David. In fact, just weeks before the election, the city of Chicago invited me to speak to voters about regarding news literacy. And one of the things that I advised the attendees to do was to basically consume content with which they disagree and content with which they did. So basically just kind of keep an open mind. So I think it is vitally important to consume content that with which we disagree. Now, I'm not advising anyone or encouraging anyone to watch Fox News. I don't consider Fox News to be, as far as journalistic integrity, I don't think that falls into that category. But I do turn to Fox News occasionally, just briefly, because I do want to hear what the other side is saying,
Well, and on the television side, yeah, there aren't a lot of choices because you can also find yourself, consuming, I guess, an MSNBC type media as well that can, again, not necessarily tell a lot of lies, but they can certainly leave a lot of things out.
You know what, David? I'm glad you touched on this. I generally do not watch the talking heads, media personalities and pundits who were supposed to be experts. I consume my news from, I might check out the NBC nightly news, ABC, NBC, of course, outlets outside the country. The talking heads, CNN is basically a talk show. It's just a, it's just a, it's, it's just a new modern day version of the Meet the Press. But I encourage news consumers to watch the news. I listen to the radio, basically just the facts, not opinion. And something else that news consumers should keep in mind is that there's there's two types of opinion. There's an informed opinion and uninformed opinion. All right. So I'm not discouraging news consumers to avoid opinion, but try to be mindful that there are informed opinions and uninformed opinions. I think the safest route is to basically consume the news, just consume the facts, uh, try to seek factual information as much as possible.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up because, yeah, it's something to think about. Like an MSNBC, for instance, they don't even do a news program. I mean, their sort of excuse for not doing that was always like, well, we're affiliated with NBC, so if you want to watch the news, go watch NBC News. We're another thing, right? And
Right.
But a lot of viewers don't necessarily realize that. Like they think they're watching news, but there really isn't any news. It's just like you say, some talking heads. Sometimes they're somewhat informed about the topic, but sometimes they're just who they had that day, and they're occupying 10 minutes, right?
Exactly. In fact, I've had conversations with educated individuals who have told me that they consume quite a bit of journalism, and they they mentioned that, say, for example, Rachel Maddow is one of their favorite journalists. So, in some instances, I correct them. In other instances, I just let it slide. But that's the confusion. A number of individuals confuse these media personalities as journalists. And I've also said that even if in a perfect world, even if journalists were to flawlessly and accurately tell stories, I don't believe that the public is really predisposed to the truth. And largely because the way we're being educated in this country. If a country is, if you have an ignorance, uninformed electorate, an uninformed electorate cannot appreciate truth. And I think we've seen that within the past 8 years.
Well, and I think even we've seen it brightly highlighted in 8 years, but I think we've seen it for the last like 30 years, or at least an increasing trend towards that, which actually is a good topic. I'm kind of trying to decide, have we crossed over to the point where the whole idea of the fourth estate and having an informed public even works? I mean, it seems like people aren't listening.
You're right. I think we are in dangerous waters. And again, I've been concerned about this past 10 years. That's one of the reasons that whenever I teach as a journalism instructor, I realize that a number of my young charges are about to enter the industry. So I'm hoping that by instilling the core principles of journalism, I'm hoping that perhaps they can probably rise to leadership positions where they can have some kind of impact. But again, even if they were to rise to those levels or rise to leadership levels, they're still operating under the thumb of these ultra wealthy individuals who own these corporations. So a number of students have started their own startups, and they have an entrepreneurial approach to the business. So I'm hopeful that perhaps some of these trailblazers can probably get some traction in this society. But I think legacy media, as we've known it, is under assault. You have an administration that's anti-media, even though the FCC basically evaluates. I don't think it evaluates the media, but you have a new FCC chief in, I think, Brendan Carr, who's anti-media. In fact, I think he launched an investigation against PBS and NPR for perhaps airing commercials. And then, even though Voice of America doesn't have anything to do with our conversation, but just to make my point, you have someone who's anti-media in Carly Lake, who's running Voice of America. So, so the media is facing some rather daunting challenges, and I think it's incumbent upon the media to really recommit to unflinchingly to the core principles of journalism. But they're going to have to regain the trust of the public. some advice I had for current day journalists: stop appearing on TV programs. You have journalists, in fact, I won't name them, but there are a number of journalists who wear both hats. You'd have a journalist who provides commentary, but at the same time reports on the news. Same journalist appear on talk shows such as Stephen Colbert. So basically, these are media stars, and it's kind of difficult for the public to really differentiate which role they are playing. I believe that if a person is a journalist, be a journalist. If a person wants to be a media star, be a media star. But I think the blurring of the lines have really diminished the credibility of this profession.
Interesting. Well, I'm really encouraged by the comment about some of your students kind of head down the entrepreneurial path, because maybe that's the impetus or the catalyst that will maybe create some change where, this system will kind of have to change, in the existing system that sort of is hard to work within. Will have to change in response if some of those entrepreneurial ideas really work. And I'm hopeful about that. I could see that being a path for a new generation of journalists.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Well, Michael Deas, thank you so much for making time for our show today.
Thank you, David. I enjoyed the conversation.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Want to dive deeper? Check out my Substack at outrageoverload.substack.com or outrageoverload.net/newsletter for more insights beyond the podcast. Subscribe, comment, and join the conversation. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.